think we can go ahead and get started since it's just after 4. Today I am excited to introduce our first traveling speaker since before the pandemic started, so it's a momentous occasion. Our speaker today is Paul Rogers. Paul holds bachelor's and master's degrees in geography from Utah State and University of Wisconsin, and he also has a doctorate in ecology from Utah State. Paul's primary area of study has been human impacts on vegetation in the western U.S. He worked for the Forest Service for 16 years, and his ecosystem monitoring research has taken him throughout the U.S. and around the world, including to Canada, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Paul is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State. He's a Utah State Ecology Center Associate and is the director of the Western Aspen Alliance. Paul currently works on issues relating to disturbance ecology and wildlife impacts and benefits to Aspen ecosystems. Please give it up for Paul.
Thanks, Connor. Can you hear me okay? Too much? Pretty intense for my name. I'm actually super excited to be here. I've been coming for a long time. I get to meet people ways, and my day is complete. This is excellent. I mean that sincerely. You'll see some names you recognize at some point in this presentation of some folks I work with. This is a grand tour. So there'll be a bit of survey, there'll be a little bit of data, but we're going to raise a lot of issues. If you're looking at somebody who's sort of Aspen's become an obsession, and if you just want to turn it off and walk out, I get it. That's happening for it, and I'm not kidding. I'm just like in deep, and that's not necessarily a compliment. It's also sort of a problem. Say with my home life or something like that. Unfortunately, I designed my presentations to go with a remote clicking device. So this is going to be a little funny and a little clumsy, but we'll make it through. So there's a lot of changes is what I'm saying. There's also a lot of 3D handout things. Part of what I do in addition to research is run an organization called the Western Aspen Alliance, which would be the next thing I would click if I had that thing. Okay, stop that. And this is essentially, it's just a clearinghouse of information. I would say it's roughly half, maybe a third researchers and 2/3 practitioners of various kinds of all stripes, all agencies, private land managers, everything. And we put on a bunch of workshops, but we assemble information and make it freely available if we can, best we can. And so some of those here, these products are mostly of the sort of professional level for field practitioners and not the technical articles and so on, but please take them in my contact information. There are these WAY briefs. WAY is short for Western Aspen Alliance on Aspen management, ungulate management, Aspen fire in Aspen, the Pando Aspen clone, biodiversity in Aspen, insects and disease in Aspen, and beaver in Aspen. And now I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to work with some local folks, hopefully in the next month or two, to get one on oyster shell scale in Aspen. And they're authored by various people. So they're 2-pagers to get information out to people who are working in the field and some of the latest science and then the broad concepts that will go into that. In addition, there's this field guide, the backpack version of the Guide to Quaking Aspen Ecology and Management. Those are free, and then some stickers and board magnets. So please take those afterwards or during or whatever you like. This is one of the few, if only, fires in the last 10 years in Central Europe in Czechia, which is short for the old Czech Republic. The joke is that now they can fit that on a hockey jersey. But a human-caused fire. It's populated now with young aspen, and it's about the only photo I have of fire in Czechia in all my time there in the last few years. But here's a roadmap of where we're headed on this talk. The scaling up thing is come in the third bullet there, but just an Aspen starter kit for those of you, just the basics of ecology, and I'll just spend 5 slides on that or so. And then talking about what I call 21st century tremblings is sort of current up and coming science and then the big research gaps as I see them. Happy for you guys to throw spears or ask questions about those things. That's all good. And then we'll kind of make this progression from a stand to a landscape to a region to a globe. And how that is touched on by some of the things I've been involved in, but also just some of the things that are going on in Aspen ecology at those scales. And then finally, we're going to bring it back down to this down to earth stuff, what I call adaptive restoration. There's lots of terms for these things. But I think it's always important to kind of get practical. At least where I'm interested in very applied forest ecology and aspen ecology. So things get rough out there sometimes, but I characterize aspen as a beautiful, thin-skinned, fire-loving clone, except when it isn't. And what I'm going to do in these slides is go through each of those elements and then kind of show you some of the exceptions. So this is not meant to be your Aspen 101 or traditional standard Aspen ecology, but it's going to be several addendums to that. And I hope there's something new that you might not have heard before. Thin-skinned, it appears that John is rather thin-skinned, and it's not happy apparently with whatever's going on with Megan. But this, you probably all heard that this, what I call thin-skinned, a thin barb plays into the ecology of aspen quite a bit. And the better we understand that, the better off we move forward in terms of what we might do in silviculture or just understanding these ecosystems. So that beautiful part is just the aesthetics of it. And we shouldn't underplay this at all, because in the Rocky Mountain West, generally speaking, this is one of the only, in many places, the dominant broadleaf tree species. And so if nothing else, nothing else today, that adds color, and we're all aware of that. And it's hard, it's unusual if I go to a meeting and someone doesn't walk up to me unsolicited and say, that's my favorite tree. And in the state of Utah, we changed this to our state tree about 8 or 9 years ago. And the secret to that is, if you ever want to get something through the state legislature, shove a bunch of 4th graders up there. No fooling, it just went right through. They changed it from the Colorado blue spruce, go figure, to the quaking aspen state tree. But it was very successful. So the aesthetics of this is appreciated, as I indicated in the abstract, by people other than scientists. And capturing this in our quarterly newsletter now, we've added an artistic element, poetry, paintings, photos, and so on. And I've gotten at least 3 or 4 contributions from this area to that part of the Tremblings newsletter, which is what you get if you get online and sign up before midnight tonight for Western Aspen Alliance membership. So let's get on with it. This thin-skinned part, what do I mean? What's going on in terms of ecology? The nutrition, as well as just the friction of these stems. And I'll try to point out geographically where we're at too. So this is Western Wyoming, and the whole stand is full of this. I know we've seen this around here quite a bit, maybe too much, but they serve an ecological purpose. But these openings, getting to that chlorophyll is a vector for all kinds of other things, pathogens mostly. And so these trees live and die really well. They live and die on a very different cycle than the conifers that are growing around them. What I mean by dying well is they're supposed to die. They're supposed to be stimulated because that sends those hormones up to make a lot of babies. And that's all happening on a cycle that's shorter and a little faster than this is happening, generally speaking, with the conifer cohort. So walking through this a little bit, the disease vectors, by the way, that's a sapsucker, that sort of horizontal pattern on the right frame there. They're open to disease, but that's a double-edged sword. That also makes the tree easily penetrable by cavity nesters. And it becomes very nice habitat, both dead and live stems. The bark color and the bark thickness can either repel sun more or absorb sun. Folks think that that's related to elevation, perhaps aspect. I know some of the pioneering work was done on that subject by Wally Covington from here. But it can also get sun scald. So if you open up a stand very quickly, for example, a clear Phalcopus cut, it's subject to wind throw, but also sun scald, where there was shade before, and that genotype and the albedo level of that, the reflectance level of that, is not adapted to being wide open quickly. And so that sun scald is an element that can damage and or kill the tree. And finally, fire. This is a subject in itself. I'll touch on it here and there throughout this. But aspen, it's possible to have a stand replacing fire where the flames never get higher than their need because of that thin skin. Now, aspen often does have a thicker bark near the bottom, and you'll see that European aspen has a very different bark. But even just the heat of a fire can kill trees or severely scar them because of the lack of protection. Again, we think of these things in very negative terms. Bummer, the tree died. The tree's saying, no, I'm going to make, 2,000 babies. So, you kind of got to think differently here about this. It's an aspen system. It's not necessarily an aspen tree. So we've all seen these kind of photos. Big response, between 2,000 and 80,000 stems per hectare following fire. We think, well, we know mostly from vegetative reproduction. And I'll come back to true seedlings in a bit here. But this, intense response. So what? You killed me. I'm going to make 10,000 more. Fire loving, except when it isn't. Many of these aspen stands, I wouldn't go so far as to use this traditional verbiage in asbestos forest, but they are not very flammable, or they're only flammable in very specific situations, much less so than perhaps the surrounding forests. So these pure or stable or persistent aspen tend to not burn. That's a probability statement. It's not an absolute. So unpacking that a little bit, I worked with some folks a few years back on this sort of, rounding up all the fire ecology we could find on aspen, and sort of laying out this sort of schematic of different, the pink red are basically conifer cirral systems. Where over time, this is your traditional, we might say, aspen ecology, where time 0, you have a lot of aspen after a disturbance. Time 100, you have a lot of conifer, and that's succession through time. And we all kind of learned that in our beginning forestry or ecology classes. However, in the lower left, there's these ones that have a low probability of burning, and not very often do they have severe fires at all, if they burn at all, these different stable types. So there's the thin skin benefits, the pros and cons. There's the fire, happens sometimes. Other places not very fire prone at all. And then there's this bit about the clone. So this is the Pando aspen clone in south central Utah, thought to be the largest living thing on Earth by dry weight, if you want to get nerdy. The chances are that we would find something else that's larger, maybe an aspen stem, maybe something else, are probably pretty good, but this is what we know of now. And by dry weight mass. So there's other things that are bigger geographic spread. It's kind of like, so what? We're not in this business to do Guinness Book of World Records. However, you can see that sort of by color alone that clone stands out. This is a photo from New Mexico, about 10 minutes in the fire zone with Mary Lou Fairweather, who many of you know, who lived around here for many years. A true seedling on the right, a sucker on the left, and she had a very good search eye for that. And this science is progressing now. I'm going to come back to that science. New clones, new genotypes, everything is not suckering. So we have these sort of new developments that are modifications of our understanding of the beautiful thin-skinned fire-loving aspen. Moving on to sort of recent science, and some breakthrough would be too far ahead of ourselves, but some recent developments that may be of interest to you. Oops, what did I do? Love this quote. I have it in my beer garden at home. We knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be science, it wouldn't be research with it. But the idea is, in a funny way, we wouldn't start a research project if we already had the answers. And we don't a lot. This is a true seedling from Idaho, Island Park area. Somebody thought it was a fun idea to take the ice out of their cooler and give it a little extra breathing room. This is a seeding event. You can see that very much like cottonwood or something. You can get a lot of seeds. The probabilities of one of them germinating and then not getting eaten by something afterwards is pretty low. You know, might be 1 in a million or 1 in a billion or something like that. And this is the part where some of the folks out of this school have played a good role. I work now with Larissa Gilcom and Karen Mock for quite a while, and our thinking on this, put it this way, we have about 1% of the knowledge as we move into this idea. So now we're finding, Larissa and her graduate students, are finding these in nearly every fire they look on. Just 20 years ago, the most common word associated with seedling was rare. And that's just not the case. However, the previous picture, you see, it looks different. I'm not good at finding them. I haven't found many, except for this one that was not near any other aspen, and we're all standing around at a workshop talking, and someone said, look at this. But they're hard to find. The leaves are lanceolate, they're shrubby, they grow slower, all these things. This is a really cool paper, really easy to get a hold of. From came out a 1.5 years ago, and it has a step-by-step. Here's what you do to find a seed. So very useful. And then this sort of new thinking, that paper is about 10 years old with Jim Long and Karen Mock on how we should begin thinking about, in terms of practical silviculture, the role of seedlings and clones in aspen, cereal, or stable forests. As I hope I made clear, we know nearly nothing. This is a wide open field. Hint, hint, graduate students. So there's some cool work being done. We're making some headway. Seedlings are out there. They create new genotypes. Ostensibly, genotypes add resilience to larger systems, new genotypes, and on and on. But we still have a lot of learning to do there. Something that I'm involved in, that the Pando clone that's been adopted from Europe and not used much in North America. It's very similar. It's mostly similar to pollen dating. Is pedoanthropology. If we unpack that, pedo, feed on layers, soil, anthro means what? Not anthro, but anthro. Charcoal, coal, and then of course the study it. So charcoal within the soil layers. This is one of my Czech colleagues at the Pando clone. These very tiny charcoal pieces. We count the amount, so we have some sense of the abundance of fire. We can ID down to genus, sometimes species, and then we can carbon date them. So we get these 3 elements out of them. What is different here, it's not in pollen dating, and there's pros and cons to both. is pollen dating will take in sort of what's in the watershed. This is more of an in situ, what happened in this site over the last centuries and millennia. And so a little bit different nuance there. And we're trying to get this paper published as well. But you get sort of the same sort of diagrams here. One of the punchlines of this story is that over the last, this doesn't show the full chronology, but we're up to about 9,000 years at Pando. There's little change in the dominance of the tree species. So we've had a lot of climate fluctuation in these millennia. We have one sort of series there, a third up from the bottom, where there's some other Douglas fir on the right and then common juniper in the center. But even then, Aspen is a little bit more dominant. But through the rest of the chronology, it's almost a 9,000 year record of Aspen dominance at this one site. Gotta be crystal clear because viewers don't like it, and we're not claiming what we're not claiming. We do not have a genotype through 9,000 years. In fact, we have no idea how old the Pando clone is, even though, shock to you, you will find all kinds of numbers on the internet. So we can age trees, a stem, but we can't age genotypes. Okay, so this is, again, this is the serial Aspen 101. Time zero, you have Aspen has a big advantage because you're not waiting for the seeds to get going. And sometimes, I think some of you have seen this around here, I have around here, you can have 0.5 meter to 1 meter tall stems within months of the actual fire. So that's pretty cool. But, and this is, you know, hypothetical here, but roughly 50, 60, 70 years, the conifer kind of overtakes that. Pretty simple concept, right? This looks like this. It strikes me, the first two photos are from near Flagstaff, but you know, kind of time zero and marching on in a general way, your kind of traditional succession. What we don't talk about and what we're learning about now is the trajectory of those Aspen obligates or dependent species. And we would think they would follow that. We have some good evidence along that, this paper and some others that I was involved in and some that I was not involved in. But understanding that trajectory is very important. A composite from Western Wyoming of the dependent species, a short list, a very short list. And its focus is, because this guy's a wildlife biologist, on animals. So lots of dependent species. I'm going to come back around that when I try to explain the term mega conservation. Another area and another paper that I'm involved in is looking at aspen, sage grouse, and climate. This is one of what we call a see-through stand. And I think those of you who have spent any time in this, you can see that this is not a really healthy forest. This is a stable aspen forest. This is not going to be taken over by conifers in 10 years or 100 years or 500 years. But where's the next generation? This is a repeating theme, not only throughout this presentation, but in many areas of the Rocky Mountain West. So we got an issue there with browsers, but we're really focused here on sage grouse. And what's the going word on sage grouse and trees? Any trees? They love them. They hate them. Anybody? No wildlife people? What's up there in the tree if I'm pretty much a ground dwelling? Predators, right? Yeah, things with claws. So that's what the whole sage grouse, ecology says. Nope, we don't like trees. In fact, our data here says the opposite, and we have some really strong trend data. But basically, the brooding distance from the trees, the occurrence of brooding size decreases as you get a distance from the trees. A couple of caveats. This is upland aspen. There's very little or no water available. This is the relatively moist site in this area, and brooding sage grouse need moisture for the diversity of the understory, particularly the diversity in the insects that are associated with them. So they're making a choice, ostensibly, between danger and successful breeding. So that's kind of a cool addition that's coming up here soon. A whole list of what are the gaps, and this is Populus tremula from northern Sweden. This is Benedicte Ulrichsen. I was talking to somebody here from biology about chemical ecology, and she's a colleague, a well-known colleague from that part of the world. That's an aspen tree in Europe, very different, and that's about the only one in this whole forest. It's surrounded by Scots pine and what we call Norway spruce, Picea aves. We spent an hour going through this. We finally crawled around and found some little teeny aspen suckers. But there's this one sort of matriarch tree there. And what's the role of that in terms of gaps? So I'll start out with some of these age-old questions that we have not answered and really need some answering. We talk about it, and oftentimes as we get further out on the ground with practitioners, they sort of talk about things like they're fact, but there's not science to support it. And so these are some of the gaps that are important. How low can you go? I've been saying this for a long time. So on that arc, when you get down to the right and you have 90%, 95, 99% conifers, is that system going to come back and ask me? We think we know, but there's not really good research or documentation of what's going to happen with that system. But we're making a lot of decisions based on what we think is an answer. This is very pertinent to this area in our friendly discussions with Arizona game and fish, as it is across the whole West. The wildlife agencies are sure they have an answer. And they like to point fingers a lot at the federal agencies and say, hey, there would be no aspen problem if you just let fires go a little more. The disturbances were larger. We could overwhelm the animals with a lot of regeneration and recruitment, aka something like the wallow fire, and everything would be cool. So, you know, don't tell us there's too many browsers. You just need to have this going on, but we have no science that I'm aware of that demonstrates that well. I do know science at the other end through 30 or 40 years in the central northern Rockies, and they didn't reach an upper limit. It started with like orders of magnitude, 5, 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000. It wasn't enough. And of course, it depends on how many animals you have. An unanswered question that's important to get to. The other end here, where a lot of us are dealing with putting barriers up of various kinds so that we can give these forests a head start post-disturbance, whether mechanical or fire or some other kind of disturbance. But we know very little about, and we're all very nervous about when to take those barriers down. No answer there. We really need some good answers. We've had some experiments where they pulled it away and woohoo, salad bar, everything got mowed down. So if you have something that's really doing well after 5 or 10 years, you don't want to toss that all out. We need to figure that out. Aspen and water conservation. Again, a lot of statements made. There's very little science. I can name a handful of papers total on we say that aspen forests hold more water on the landscape. There's a seasonal fluctuation factor in that that's not really nailed down. And so when we're going to do aspen restoration for water conservation, we think logically there's some truth to that, but we don't have good data to support it. Aspen as fire breaks. This is something that Larissa and 2 or 3 other lab groups around the West are working at now, Larissa Yoakum. So again, another one of these things that's common fact out there on the ground, but very little science. I call a wildland developed interface. some people say urban, but a lot of these areas are ex-urban or rural, resorts or whatever. Choose your verbiage, but are these really effective fire breaks? Under what conditions? You know, fire is highly variable. So I was just talking to the folks across campus this morning. They're going to plant Aspen where it didn't exist before around some small towns and cities in Alaska, in the boreal forest. Assuming we know this, and let's say we're pretty sure it's probably true, but where's the data? Where's the support for that? Ecological role of seedlings, I already pointed that out. We just know a fraction of what that means in terms of good thing, bad thing, migration, climate, all of these other questions coming into play. But we're just touching on that because for so many years we thought it was a fact that these are rare or they don't happen, these seeding events. When obviously they do. We're finding them now almost everywhere. This I don't have to say too much about. I had to throw into everything, but it's very similar in my mind, and you can all add to this because the folks around here have done more on this than me, and I'm trying to tag along on that research. But you know, what is this ecology? What's the spread? How do we mitigate it? Just everything about this topic. I was hiking in the backcountry of Bryce Canyon, and came on this in a sea of conifers surrounded by a sea of desert, this one little spring that's got some aspen, not near any roads or anything, and there's oyster shell scale in there. How did it get there? Do we know? Looking for answers. Yeah. Finally, then climate change responses, and let me go into that right here. Again, we have some preliminary work. We're pretty good at modeling temperature. We're not as good at modeling precipitation. There's a lot of variability there, especially in my area, in the Middle Rockies. We're kind of Ouija boarding that. We don't really know. Pretty good at modeling with some level of confidence the drying trend going forward. So traditionally in any field, you sort of start out with a climate envelope model. You take the habitat here, find out what the boundaries are of that, and you move it through time. And often it shrinks. Especially shrinks if you're dealing with montane environments, which are essentially a lot of pyramids, right? As you move up a pyramid, your area gets smaller. So the habitat, this paper by Rayfeld and others, is going to shrink through the next 100 years. Okay, so stage 2 would be to add in different aspen types and disturbance factors. Instead of just habitat moving forward through time, how would they be affected by disturbance? It turns out scenario B is kind of going in the opposite direction. So if we have more drought and more fire, we create more situations in which we have these strong vegetative responses, and then the wild card of what does that mean for seedlings and what does that mean for colonizing new areas? And now there's a 2010 paper from Alberta where they did some lodgepole pine cutting, a couple 100 meters elevation above where aspen grew, and some aspen seeding took place in that area. In the last 6 months, there's been a couple new papers come out of Colorado talking about the same general effect. So, we don't know. There's probably, as far as we know now, it's a little of each. It's pretty wide open area here. We're just getting started on this. Here's those couple of other papers in there by the group of, well, basically out of Fort Collins. You have, I'm sorry, out of Boulder and then out of Fort Collins. And then this group out of the USGS looking at stuff in the Great Basin. So I will say this over and over, probably till I keel over. I'm very concerned about how we treat issues related to climate change, because it can develop a fatalistic or defeatist thing. We're not changing fast enough. If you look at that top scenario, the aspen's going downhill, there's nothing we can do about it. And I use the analogy where we're driving a car super fast, Thelma and Louise toward the cliff. Are we going to maybe swerve? Are we going to slow down? the resilience, the stuff that we can do, and sometimes we put in a precarious position, is the stuff we can work on now where we're trying to work out and slow down the climate change. But we're starting to hear more and more from managers that this is a done deal, or what are we going to do about it? In fact, we've put ourselves in non-resilient situations in many cases. That could apply to other forests, but this is one forest type that I'm more familiar with. So managing for resilience is a key and is something that we can do now. Think of ungulate management, thinking of fire suppression, thinking of some other factors. How do they play into this? That's the stuff we can work on now, even our silvicultural techniques. Okay, now I'm going to change gears again and do this sort of, scaling up part. This is the Pando clone. This is all one living thing, one living genotype in south central Utah, 106 acres in size, estimated 47,000 stems. And so now we're at the stand level. I love this phrase. We usually just like phrases that kind of mess with ourselves. But it's a one tree forest. It's a very unique forest. I do some research there myself, but dealing with that may have lessons for Aspen as we go up the scale. For example, I was talking to Liza Gillespie a couple hours ago about the chemical ecology. Well, that's welded into the genotype, as is the bark color, as are many other factors, growth versus defense, and so on, triploidy, cytotype. All of these things are related to genotype. So if this really large organism has one genotype, what can we learn from that as we go forward? I'm not going to spend too much time on the data, but this is a diagram. We have a red area is a new fence that we put up, an exposure. The blue area that we're doing so good, we're so happy with ourselves, we put up another one. It essentially failed. And the yellow is the outline of the clone itself. You can see that purple there in the really dense area of the Pando clone. Some people refer to that as the bamboo forest. That's a clear-felled coppice that from 1992, which they fenced in and all grew back the same age. Now, without getting too sidetracked on the ecology of stable aspen, there's no conifer competition here per se. It's not going to succeed in conifer, as our pedoanthropology sort of suggested. But we've got all even aged 6-7 meter tall aspen in that dense area, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Just to the left of that, I say this very slowly every time, there's a bare spot. It's actually two bare spots. So there's a 1987 and 1988 clear-felled coppice. There's nothing living there aspen-wise now. So we could say we learned, that's great. But imagine this thing that's around for centuries, perhaps millennia, and on our watch in the 1980s, over a long, long lifetime, boom, nothing there. Okay, something's out of balance here. And so trying to unravel this has been a bit of a mystery. This is a publication that's in review now. It gets a little complex, but some of the key indicators are regeneration, the ones that are less than your head height, recruitment, taller than head height but not mature, and then the browse level. Sometimes we compare all three areas, the 2013 fence and 2014 fence and unfenced area. About half of the total area remains unfenced. That's usually the left column. When there's only two columns, we're just looking at no fence in 2014, and there's some reasons for that. But basically, regeneration, that's the exact same result as this study 4 or 5 years earlier. But if we took out the 2013 and we just compared those two head to head, and we took out the shortest ones because there was some anomalous growth of really short ones. For some reason, they hadn't been browsed yet that year, even though we could measure every time in June. We had a significant difference between those and regeneration. I tell people all the time, if there's one thing you're going to measure in an aspen forest, measure recruitment. That's the middle one. Those are the ones that ostensibly escape the browsing level. We know from this area, anecdotally, that elk especially will push over very tall trees, break them and eat the tops off. But that's somewhat unusual as far as the regional picture. So again, we had no recruitment, essentially, where it's not fenced. We had some recruitment, but my problem was we were calling this stuff that was still sapling size and 25 years old recruitment when it was past that stage. So when I removed that and just compared all three of them with that one section removed, about 5 survey plots, we got a really different result, and we had adequate recruitment in. I'm sorry, we did not have adequate recruitment in any area except for this red block there. Unfortunately, this year, I don't have data on this, but 90% of all the recruitment in the red block got black paint. So it's looking a little rough. We don't know what that means yet. And then finally, we look at the browse levels. I kind of did the same trick as the top row there. Just now, I'm just looking at no fence and it's 2014 fence, that larger area in the blue. And I removed the youngest ones, and the browse levels were markedly different. Even this one, the p-value is 0.07, so it's not quite significant, but we do have a difference in terms of the browse level inside and outside the fence. That seems pretty logical, but the problem is in this paper we did not have that. Animals were getting into that upper area. We spent extra money reinforcing this fence. And there's a lot of problems, in my opinion, with fences. This is not the solution to things. However, it's a specialty situation. Let's jump up the ladder a little bit to a landscape. This is a private ranchette, kind of hoity-toity development called Wolf Creek Ranch, where the Uinta Mountains meet the Wasatch Range. And we were looking at this browsing factor predominantly. But what this shows is just a histogram of the plots that meet the criteria of 1-to-1, meaning recruitment to live overstory. And ones to the left are where there was inadequate recruitment. To the right, it's about 50% of the total plots are inadequate recruitment. And I'm going to come back to something they call the refuge effect in a minute. I think that's a great symbol for their Wolf Creek Ranch has no wolves, but we have plenty of cows. This is, if you're not familiar with, this is an ordination called multidimensional scaling. It's a little complex, but the symbols are a qualitative rating of stands. The qualitative rating makes it hard to get it in the poor or the good camp, but makes it easy to lump things in the middle, which is the everything else. And you see those are scattered all over the open circles. The red is to the left in poor quality. The green, there's very few, I think 3 stands total that are in good quality and qualitative rating. Part of what this shows is that our physical measurements confirm the qualitative rating. And if you're to the left, if you can't see, you probably can't because the print is very small. That vector there in the ordination is basically presence of elk. To the right is successful recruitment, diametrically opposed to each other. And the other axis is basically overall tree production. We could map that geographically, and we'll see here that there's this zone here that really corresponds well, visually at least, with high elk presence and very little successful recruitment in the middle of this private ranch area. And so this is a paper really focusing on this idea of animals coming off of the federal land onto private land because they know it's safe. And I'm going to drill down on that idea in a minute here. So looking at the region, this idea of Aspen functional types, how do we, the whole point of this functional types is to manage with their actual ecological processes of mind. That's the basis of this booklet here that you can take for free and some of these other documents. But basically you have that split between cereal and stable types. And you have these subtypes. We don't have to go into those now. We have sort of a split where in the riparian area you can have stable aspen or cereal. the key difference here is the dynamics of stable is between tree height and architecture within the stand. So diversity and vertical diversity. The dynamics in the zero is between species. How does that change over time? How does that inform what we're going to do if we're going to successfully try to regenerate or restore these systems? That's the concept behind this. And then geographically, they're distributed across the West, some more at a landscape scale, some at a large regional scale. And that's the map. This is basically just Little's map of Aspen coverage. And then these different types superimposed on that, and then a projection of the ones that are at the landscape level. And so, for example, you have something called a snow pocket aspen, where the stands are often maybe the size of this room, pretty small, and often surrounded by non-forest systems, like in this diagram here. Actual oases of biodiversity, often in sagebrush or alpine sea of less diversity and no forest. So these are the concepts that go along with this, and I'd love to talk about these more and debate them. They're broad concepts. A lot of them are accepted in forest management generally, but they apply here more specifically to Aspen. So recognizing the variability, something that was not done, for example, in the climate envelope model. It's not criticism of it, it's just was the first shot over the bow. There's variability in types and systems and how they work. We should understand those processes, and generally, I think it's the accepted paradigm in natural resource management at large that we'll have better prospects if we emulate natural disturbance as opposed to going against it or trying to make systems and what we want them to be. In my opinion, that's sort of one of the great lessons learned in ecology, perhaps, but certainly forest ecology over the last century or so. Manage and monitoring we should monitor and manage the response, not the event. You know that our media is so fixed on that thing, and they use a lot of pejoratives and negative terminology, for example, after fire. This is destroyed, this landscape, it's this, it's that. But we should be really monitoring for what happens next. I get frustrated reading even some scientific papers where they don't tell us that. They tell this story and they just end here, like that's the end of the game. But we all want to know, and we're all learning in our classes, like the dynamics of the system, not this fixed and point time thing. Things are not that sad. Sudden aspen decline, let's say, is probably a pretty rare event. It's not occurring that much. However, there are combinations of things, what I call de facto sad, where there's a drought and perhaps insects, but where's the babies, the natural response? And combine that with browsing, and then you have die-off of systems, but it's got to be repetitive, and it's not very sudden. However, these things are occurring, systems are dying off. And we should look at restoration and probably forest management in general as an experiment, not as a fixed formula. So we're adjusting as we go. I think we're all aware of that. So scaling up finally to the planet level. I can see I'm running a little late on time here, but which is the aspen in the photo? The one that's not quite so white. The others are birch. This is in Scandinavia. This is Populus tremula. This same formula. Skip ahead here. This idea of mega conservation at the global scale, 6 or 7 aspen species wrapping around the entire northern hemisphere. The idea is you're focused on these obligates. These systems support very high biodiversity, and that's consistent through the different aspen species. We focus a lot of our conservation funding at the global level on high-profile megafauna, charismatic megafauna, and throw a lot of money at things that live in a narrow niche. We flip that around, a somewhat common species that's often abused, misused, not favored, but supports hundreds of species in a keystone or foundation fashion. wouldn't that be a legitimate alternative to conservation if our goal was to conserve a lot of species? This is the paper done on that with 14 or so authors from 8 or 9 countries across the Northern Hemisphere, just these different types to get a look-see. We also looked at the specialties and what folks did a principal components analysis on what folks study, regional preferences, and I'm saying world regions. And there's a bit of difference there. For example, the Western United States more focused on disturbance, ecology, succession, maybe some on silviculture, more focused on genetics, diversity, and so on in other regions, Eastern US, Europe. Getting down to the management part, adaptive restoration. This is the Black Hills. Historically, compared to this Kaibab Plateau, this northern Arizona region, because of the dominant species. This famous quote that we should all be aware of: keep every cog in wheel as a first precaution of intelligent tinkering. This is the Black Hills in the mid-60s. This is still going on in Siberia and parts of China, where we're actively plowing up Aspen systems and trying to get rid of them. That's the before and after. Not that long ago in the history of forests. Trying to get rid of them. The photo on top, underneath that, the top part of that, is a workshop 2 years ago where they're trying to do the opposite. And it's really the wildlife folks stepping forward and saying, man, these are super valuable systems. We need to do a better job of managing them. The concept of borderlands on the right, Alaska. Obviously, a lot of these disturbances don't respect boundaries. This one is a unique one, which I was almost called to court for in eastern Idaho. Could you please take some herbicide and spray along the fence? Sure, airplane pilot. I sprayed right along the fence. It killed 8 acres of the next door neighbor's property in Aspen Forest when they had a conservation easement for 100 years on that. So big problems there, but the person on the right side of that wanted to get rid of aspen to increase forage for his cattle. There's a lot of problems with that statement. However, poisoning the trees, borders between private to private, federal to private, there's a lot of issues with borders, including this refuge effect. This is area, huge landholding in southern Colorado, where they can't do anything without using fences. They can't do any silvicultural management, any burning, cutting, anything at all without putting up fences because the elk herbivory is so intense. I like that term, habitat compression. They're taking healthy habitat and we're pushing it into smaller and smaller areas. This is southwest Wyoming, and the white there is Fossil Butte National Monument, a very small national monument, it's like 800 acres. And that's the migration patterns. In the red area are the animals that migrate to the refuge each year. And the blue area, they migrate to another area off to the left. The punchline of this slide is the date when they show up every year. It's the first day of hunting season. Really, no joke. The animals know where it's safe. They go to private land, they go to areas where there's no hunting. And those areas have a concentrated amount of herbivory. And we got to figure this out because the private landowners, the Park Service, for example, Rocky Mountain National Park, it's kind of a disaster in terms of aspen ecology because of the animals. They know they're safe there. It's a safe refuge. Another fire here, the Trenchero Ranch, I think one of the largest ranches in the US. These people own the whole mountain ranges. This is a 20-year-old fire, or 10-year-old fire, 20,000 acres at 10,000 feet. When you got out of the truck, you smelled elk like it was a feedlot. At this point, my own time in my career, I almost saw a wildlife biologist and the silviculturist who's very well known on this campus almost get into it. They were so upset with each other. And I don't blame them. But this is just crazy, the amount of animals, particularly in the state of Colorado. But they were even browsing on the ponderosa pine, which I think we have some of in this area too. So pretty serious. So we could take these two approaches, preventative or adaptive, basically put up barriers. That's the simplistic, just put a Band-Aid on and we'll figure it out later. Or monitor, okay, this didn't go well, you know, everything's getting grouse, we had a fire, what do we do? What are we going to adjust? How are we going to keep the animals moving and so on? Wallow fire here, putting some of these practices into motion. This is all in this handbook, but it's basically adaptive monitoring. Develop a plan collaboratively, lay it out, and you've got to have the monitoring. Traditionally, we have a big problem with monitoring. It's the last paragraph in the management plan, and it's the first thing to get cut when the money doesn't show up. And I suggest that we think about moving that up or just putting it in a cycle, that we do that as a regular practice. This is monitoring and showing some recovery. This is anecdotal. It's a single photo of wolves in the Teton area. This is probably the longest known monitoring plots of aspen in existence, at least in the Western US. They started in the 1970s. And they were showing some good results when we were there 8 or 10 years ago. So some of the problems we have here in our system and a running counter to active monitoring is that we have this false assumption that of positive outcomes. Old Herb put that in, he knew exactly what he's doing, he does the same thing, stamp it across the landscape, and you know you're successful when you walk away. And then this has happened over and over again, 30 years later, 20 years later, whatever. Whoa, what were they thinking? That kind of thing. We know it's not always a priority, insufficient data, losing institutional knowledge, the backside of not talking to Old or where are the records, where you might have taken some data or whatever. We lose that. All these things are barriers that we run into for monitoring, but we can do better than that. Southwest Wyoming, we have these stands completely blinking out because of their overuse. And then different management practices. Fire, this is just a selective cut in Montana in the upper right. Had a great response. They monitored it afterwards. It even has an apron where the aspen is expanding out. Here you probably can't see, but that fence is up. It starts about a ½ meter up in the air. It lets in some herbivores and not others. And they have successful recruitment inside that exposure. And then these brush fences that are so popular in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. I want to leave you with this thought, well, with a couple thoughts. These friends of mine that work in beaver restoration, by the way, the collision of beaver and aspen, the two keystone species, is pretty powerful in terms of diversity, but they subjugated, they stole this popular emblem. If you can't read it, it says process-based restoration. But the inefficient forest, they talk about the inefficient stream. And sometimes, maybe many times, we should think about, we spend a lot of time trying to engineer forests or streams or other natural resource elements, wildlife, for example. And the inefficiency of that has a lot of positive ecosystem attributes. In this case, if you look close, there's all different ages on this landscape of stable aspen where beaver are harvesting in patches. And they're moving up and down the stream, and they're spreading water across the landscape. And the aspen stands are expanding, but they're all different sizes and age classes. So just quickly here, to end on this slide, moving forward, the sharing is caring, or putting community back in ecology is, we got to get to a point where we're working cross-agency, interdisciplinary, and transboundary. I know people say, you know, nice sounding words like this all the time, but we're still not good at this. And we still need to improve on it, in my opinion. With that, I will end and thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I went a little bit long. I just had too much to say. And it's 5 o'clock now. The initial thoughts, and I understand we're going to have a discussion in another room here too, but responses, I danced over a huge amount of territory there. So he brings up the idea of wolves. It says, are wolves a potential solution? I just finished a grad student, she published a few papers, PhD. I was on the committee looking at this issue. It's complex in Yellowstone, but I don't think they're the silver bullet. However, there's two factors we need to understand when it comes to trophic cascades or predator-prey target species, is that the numbers and the movement. And so clearly the reduction in numbers in the northern range of Yellowstone has had a positive effect. The part about the fear of landscape and the movement is very much an open question. There's a lot of debate, scientific debate around that. I think that it could be nothing but, it could have a positive effect, but there's many areas where that's not possible for various reasons, political, cultural, whatever. And so what are we going to do there? Yes, it could definitely be positive, but I would say most of our landscapes, we're kind of not ready for that, in my opinion. It's a tough issue, but I think we started out thinking this is great, but it's also has some impracticalities to it. So our modern day hunters, our modern day predators are hunters and automobiles. It's not enough. And there's incentives to keep those animals like this, where their natural fluctuations would do this, but there are incentives built into our system to keep them high. And that's problematic. I kind of went off a little bit. I appreciate that question. Other thoughts, responses? Yeah.
That's the question. Another landscape scale disturbance in the western United States are beetle outbreaks that kill the monsters. What do we know about the response of Aspen, big stands to severe bark beetle mortality?
Yeah, what do we know about that interaction between conifer bark beetles and aspen? What's the response of aspen? Most of that work comes out of north central Colorado. There's been a couple of waves of people working on that question. I would say we don't have really great answers, but there are some positive effects. I'm curious if we'll have any true seeding events after that. But definitely opening up the space, killing a lot of conifers seems to be a positive, but I have to qualify that the science is pretty rudimentary in that zone. But when we, sort of related question, when we stack multiple disturbances on top of each other, in a moderately short time frame, there's some really good work that says we're favoring aspen. And folks I was talking to across campus today say it's definitely the case going on in the boreal forest in Alaska, where they see big shifts sort of going towards hardwoods. With, in this case, it's leaf miner and some other things happening there. So don't know a lot about mountain pine beetle. There's a review paper in the 2013 review issue, Aspen review issue of volume 299 of Forest Ecology and Management. It's all devoted to different subtopics of aspen ecology. There's a review paper by Kristen Hells that looked at that question. Yeah. I have ideas about that. Do I have facts or absolute knowledge? No. Is aspen, as we've seen many times, if it's in a pure form, which it often is, whether sterile or stable following fire for some X amount of years, it's hard to burn. Apparently, I learned this morning that's maybe not the case in Alaska, so the system I don't know as well. So it's hard to do, first off. But I think that generally speaking, aspen systems are pretty resilient, and the responses, you hurt me, looked at me, pinched me, poked me, I'm going to make more babies. But they can only, and there are so many rounds of that. You can think of a similar scenario with browsing. You know, if it's chronic, it's hard to keep pushing up more. You start, the fuel in the engine is carbohydrates. The engine's hidden underground. We don't know a lot about what happens underground, but we do know you need a lot of photosynthesis to feed that system to be ready for whatever response. And eventually it starts running out of steam. We don't know the numbers real well. I'm talking in generalities. We don't know the details of that formula. these are great. All right. Next discussion, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it.